I actually dabble in academia a little bit more than I used to because I've finally taken on a teaching assignment at AU. I teach a course on Turkey, Turkish foreign policy and domestic politics. And I also present the daily commentary on Turkish TV, which is immensely attractive for those of us who think that people don't read or try to understand what it is that we're saying. So they give me 15 minutes on TRT Turk, which used to be TRT Int, which is almost, like I said, irresistible, and it's a lot of fun. Anyway, I was asked to talk about Turkey's changing foreign and energy policy priorities. Now, of course, that assumes that they are changing, which is true. This is actually a fascinating time to be looking at both energy and foreign policy. But before I begin, let me try and ascertain what most of you are interested in. Those who follow Turkish foreign policy closely, how many of you are there in the audience? 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry, I should have turned that off. I apologize. I'm keeping it on only for the time, and because there's no clock, so I don't know where we're going. Okay, energy issues, including Turkey or otherwise, yes. Eurasian energy corridors and so on. Okay, a lot more. Anybody follow Turkish domestic politics or economy? Just out of interest, 1 or 2. Okay. Although that's slightly beyond the scope of the talk, I will actually touch on that as well. Now, what are we talking about now? We're talking about the foreign policy of AK, which has been in office since 2002. Now, sure, Turkey had a foreign policy beforehand, but the changes that are underway, which I will get into, are really those that have been brought about or developed or accelerated during the past 7 years. And by that, and then we'll get into this as well, the opening to the countries and areas on Turkey's borders. However, in spite of the openings, my main argument will be that Turkey still is wedded to the original goal of Kemal Atatürk when he established the state 86 years ago today, which is that Turkey wishes to be part of the Western community of nations. Now, there's a raging debate in Washington. It may not be raging, but it's just beginning. But sure enough, I think it'll get stronger by the time that Prime Minister Erdogan comes to visit President Obama on December 7th, as to whether Turkey is moving away from its commitment to the West, not just to the United States, but also to the EU, which it hopes to join one day, and is actually establishing relations with the Arab countries, Iran on its border, and the wider Islamic world, and thus moving away from its commitment. I don't think that's the case. Now, the reason that is being raised at all is because the party that's in power, AK in Turkish, Adalet ve Kalkınma, or Justice and Development in English, the JDP, has its roots in political Islam. From the outset, it is said that it's an Islamist party, but the fact that we have a party with its roots in the Islamist movement and political Islam has led people to say that the opening to the Muslim countries, to the wider Islamic world, is part of the AK party's desire to move Turkey closer to the Islamic world. Clearly, the AK party has been uncomfortable with some aspects of the vigorous secular system in Turkey. Headscarf, to take one example. There was a constitutional court case, as you know, which almost led to the closing down of the party. Again, it's beyond the confines of the talk today. But those who argue that Turkey is indeed changing its foreign policy priorities and moving away from the West certainly base their arguments to a great extent on what is happening in Turkey's borders. Now, this is a party that came into power in 2002, which continued the process of reforms designed to satisfy the political requirements, or the requirements for political eligibility, as is called, the Copenhagen criteria for EU membership, and eventually began accession talks in 2005. It also has continued, despite the difficulties created in 2003 by the refusal of the Turkish Grand National Assembly to allow U.S. troops to go through Turkey to attack Iraq from the north, to develop a close relationship with the U.S. It may not be a strategic partnership in the classical sense that we knew during the Cold War, but nonetheless it has maintained a good relationship with the West. In that sense, it was very different to the more overtly Islamist parties that have shared power in Turkey before, like the National Salvation Party or the Welfare Party under Mr. Erbakan, which went out of its way to try and curry favor with the Muslim countries and to move away from the West. Now, Mr. Erdogan, the Prime Minister, and the current party are not doing that. What I think, and I hope to show this in my presentation today, is that they want to try and balance the ongoing relationship with the US, with all its problems, with the EU, with all its problems, with their opening to the Islamic world. Now, I said it was a good time to be talking about this because Prime Minister Erdogan has just been in Iran. He had a meeting with the Supreme Leader, Mr. Ayatollah Khamenei. He had a meeting with President Ahmadinejad. He met the Speaker of the Parliament, Mr. Larijani. Spent 2 days there. Made significant statements about how Iran was being treated unfairly on its nuclear program, how it was entitled to a peaceful program, that countries that had nuclear weapons did not have the right to preach to Iran. He also signed a series of agreements, mostly in the energy sector, which I will touch on when I actually get into the energy side of the issue. Now, of course, this is good for the Iranians because the Iranians are under great deal of pressure from the West, particularly the Geneva and Vienna talks with the 5+1 led by the U.S. With the discovery of the second nuclear site at Qum, the U.S. is clearly putting the pressure on them. And although I don't think that Mr. Obama or his team want to exercise the military option, that they still say, National Security Advisor Jones said that just 2 days ago at a conference, it's still on the table. Nonetheless, if the talks fail, they will push for an embargo. And if you look at the map, you can see that an embargo on Iran must include Turkey. And here is Turkey signing additional agreements, including a major gas agreement with Iran. So I think this is a case where there will need to be a balance between what Turkey is doing with as part of his openings to the outside world and the United States. A few days before, Turkey and Syria removed visa restrictions on their common border. Now, the little bit of Turkey that juts into Syria on the map, as you can see, those who are familiar with it, is the old Ottoman province of Alexandretta, well, actually the Sanjak of Alexandretta, Iskenderun, to use the Turkish name, Hatay, to use this new name, which joined Turkey at the end of the 30s, and which the Syrians have always claimed, or at least until recently, as part of Syria, the old province of Sham, that was part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this was inconceivable just a few years ago, because Syrians had harbored the head of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan. Syria and Turkey almost went to war over this issue. And now here we have the lifting of visa restrictions. There was a joint cabinet meeting. And clearly, in addition to Iran, Turkey's opening up to Syria. It makes sense from the Syrian point of view, because the Syrians are still involved in the map has disappeared, but I will go on. If we need it, I'll put it back on. Could I start it from this here? Do you know?
I think so.
Which button do I press? Do you have any idea?
I think anyone should be the best, right?
Okay. Okay. Makes sense from the Syrian point of view. They have the ongoing problem, of course, with Israel, which has gone on for 60 years. They've had problems with Iraq, and of course, they've been accused of all sorts of things on Lebanon. So a close relationship with Turkey makes a lot of sense for Syria as well. Now, parallel to that, again, I'm just touching on the most contemporary events. Turkey canceled the Anatolian Eagle exercises, the annual exercises with Israel. And this came at a time when Turkey and Israel have had a very difficult relationship, beginning with the January spat between Prime Minister Erdogan and Israeli President Shimon Peres at the Davos meeting. Turkey, in particular Mr. Erdogan, has gone out of his way to express sympathy for the plight of the Gaza Palestinians and to condemn the actions of the Israelis, including support for the Goldstone report that the Israelis have said that they do not want to be tabled and adopted at the Security Council. So the perception has arisen over the past weeks, particularly in the Israeli, on the Israeli side, that Turkey is moving closer to the Arab world and shunning Israel to the point of making it impossible to talk about a strategic partnership between Turkey and Israel, which is developed particularly in the past decade and a half. So legitimate questions have been raised, as I said, as to whether Turkey is, moving away from Israel and moving towards the Arab countries, although the Turkish officials that I talked to when I attended the Istanbul Forum last Monday and Tuesday of last week are at pains to say that, no, we're improving our relationship with the Islamic world, but this is really not at the expense of Israel, and further afield, our Western friends should understand it. Now, it's also drawing closer to Russia. I mean, you can see it on the map. Now, Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union, which it stretched all the way to the Turkish northeastern border, to the Georgian, Armenian, and Azeri Soviet republics. And needless to say, that was the successor to the Russian Empire, with which the Ottoman Empire had countless wars, major and minor. And after the Second World War, the Soviet Union wanted bases on Stalin wanted bases on the Bosphorus, wanted certain provinces in eastern Turkey, and was instrumental in helping push Turkey into an alliance with the United States and ultimately into NATO. And now what do we see? We see a very close relationship with Russia, particularly in the energy sector. Mr. Putin, the Russian Prime Minister, really the strong man of Russian politics, even though we have a different president now, came to Turkey, signed 20 agreements, including some unexpected ones like South Stream going through Turkish waters, or at least Turkish economic exploitation zone, the Samsung Ceyhan pipeline, and so on. I will get into this, but again, what we now have is instead of an inimical, mutually hostile relationship between Moscow and Ankara, we actually have a developing relation. Now, how does that fit in to Turkey's alignment with the West? Turkey, during the last year's war between Russia and Georgia, pointedly refused to take sides. Prime Minister Erdogan said, on one side of this war, we have Russia, a major trading partner, and on the other side, we have our strategic partner, the United States, and we don't want to choose sides, he said. Now, that would have been unthinkable in the Cold War, because clearly Turkey was committed to being on the side of the United States in the Cold War confrontation. In fact, the original 1951 Joint Chiefs of Study on whether Turkey should be brought into NATO was actually stressed the fact that Turkish territory allowed NATO to expand right under the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, as it was. Now we're talking about cooperation between Turkey and Russia. Like I said, close. It would have been unthinkable before. Now, the opening to these openings, and there are others that I will get into, really fit into the foreign policy of the current government, and they talk about two main goals in this new foreign policy priorities, shall we say, or the new foreign policy approach that they've adopted. One is, no doubt you heard about this, zero problems with neighbors. Okay, Mr. Davutoğlu, who was previously national security advisor, foreign policy advisor to Mr. Erdogan, and is now foreign minister, has been stressing this for some time. This is very much part of his book, where he talked about strategic depth. And so Turkey is seeking to improve relations with countries on its border. And secondly, as part of this, the second goal, to broaden its influence beyond its borders. That includes, trade and commerce. So, which countries have, and look at the map, has Turkey improved its relations with? Well, we talked about Iran. That border has been the same for 4 centuries now, and almost 4 centuries. It's where the Shia world ended and the Sunni world began. where the Safavids, who were Shia, and the Ottomans fought, and that line eventually became the border. So Turkey is improving its relations with Iran, as I said. Syria, we talked about. Greece, in spite of problems with Greece over Cyprus, they've certainly improved. That didn't begin with the current government, but the current government has certainly taken it and moved forward. It was interesting to note that Mr. Papandreou, who recently won the Greek elections, defeating Mr. Karamanlis, flew off to Turkey for a Balkan conference, foreign ministers conference, because he carries that portfolio. That's making it clear that he certainly wants to continue that close relationship. Bulgaria, some of us around the table remember the great tensions during the days of Zhivkov. Now Turkey and Bulgaria have a close relationship. Now, of course, Bulgaria and Greece are in the European Union, and Turkey is not. That creates a disparity in the relationship. But it's not the fault of the Bulgarians and the Greeks that they've been admitted and Turkey's been excluded. And there's a cordial relationship with both countries. Iraq, troubled country, of course. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a difficult neighbor. Nonetheless, Turkey tried to maintain as close a relationship with them as possible, at least until 1990. When Turkey broke relations because of its invasion of Kuwait, and ultimately, while it did not back the U.S. in the initial attack, accepted the reality of U.S. Occupation and has tried to help as much as possible. Now there is a complication, of course, in the fact that in the north of Iraq there's an autonomous Kurdish zone, and there are PKK camps in northern Iraq, which Turkey's bombed ultimately with real-time U.S. intelligence material. Nonetheless, Turkey's gone out of its way to try and befriend the Iraqi central government. They've held a joint cabinet meeting with Iraq, just as they did with Syria. They've kept the Kurdish regional government at arm's length. Turkey does not recognize the Kurdish regional government, which is the part of Iraq immediately beyond Turkey's borders. They treat that as part of the Iraq, the state of Iraq. The president of Iraq is, of course, an ethnic Kurd. The foreign minister of Iraq is an ethnic Kurd. They deal with them, but they will not open or have not opened a consulate in Erbil, and they'd be loath to see the Kurdish regional government take over Kirkuk. But nonetheless, we can say that it is as part of their opening to the south. They have tried to maintain a close relationship with Iraq. Then there's Armenia. I'm sure some of you have heard that there was a very significant event recently in Geneva, where I think it was Geneva. It wasn't Zurich. Was it Zurich? Was it Zurich? It was Zurich. Okay, in Zurich, for the diplomatic protocols were signed for, which envisaged the opening of the border. Now, Turkey, of all the countries on its border, this is the one the border that was closed. Turkey did recognize the Armenian Republic as the successor state to one of the 15 successor states to the Soviet Union when it collapsed at the end of 1991. But although the border was open initially, it closed it because of the Armenian occupation of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is Azeri territory. It also was uncomfortable with the fact that Armenia did not define its western border in accordance with the Treaty of Kars of 1921. And thirdly, it blamed the government in Yerevan for backing the Armenian diaspora's effort to get recognition for the genocide in the US as well as elsewhere. Nonetheless, with US encouragement, Turkey has moved ahead with this, but we shouldn't expect that border to be open in the near future, because just as on previous occasions, most notably in the 1990s, didn't work. Didn't work again. Am I pressing the wrong buttons? I pressed the correct button. No. All right, I may have to get up because it's going to get annoying, because I will refer to the map, at least in the initial part. Nonetheless, with U.S. encouragement, they moved ahead with the signing of these protocols, as I said. But because the peace talks between the Armenians and the Azeris has not led to a settlement, and because the Armenians have yet to withdraw from those lands, Turkey has now made it clear that it will not withdraw from, it will not actually open that border until that happens. Now, this suggests that this is not a bilateral, but a trilateral relationship, because the Azeris do seem to have a de facto veto on what happens between Turkey and Armenia. There have been tensions between the Turks and the Azeris over the Turkish signing of this protocol. And the Turks have gone out of their way to try and mollify some of the anger on the part of the Azeris. But, you know, at least the Turks have shown that they are interested in a relationship with Armenia. And let's see where it goes. Now, Georgia, troubled country. As part of its opening to Georgia, Turkey is now treating the southern city of Batumi in Georgia as part of a domestic route network on THY. So if you want to go to Artvin or Hopa in the North Trap Zone on the Black Sea coast, you go to Batumi and then you come back, and they treat it as a domestic port. Saakashvili must have been disappointed with the Turkish attitude, particularly with its unwillingness to side with Georgia against Russia. The fact that the Turks put forward a Caucasus Stability Pact, which Prime Minister Erdogan first took to Moscow before he brought to Georgia, and the fact that the Turks, while not recognizing the two breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Algeria, have nonetheless not. Abkhaz, what did I say? Algeria. Excuse me. Algeria is not.
It's not that problem.
No. Well, yes.
By making Batumi part of Turkey.
Yeah, and Astana Bashisa was kicked out. Sorry, I mixed up my Abkhaz and Algiers, which is easy to do. Abkhaz are to the north, Algiers are to the south. Abkhazia, nonetheless, a senior Turkish foreign ministry official recently visited Abkhazia, and that annoyed the Georgians. But you know, Saakashvili has no alternative but to try and get on with the Turks because he's pressured from the north, and so there's a fairly cordial relationship with the Georgians. Now, parallel to this, Turkey's made an effort, you know, good faith according to the Turks, not so according to those who don't believe in it, to solve the Cyprus problem. It backed the UN plan in 2002, which carried the name of the then Secretary General Kofi Annan, which eventually went to a referendum. The referendum, the Turkish Cypriots said yes, the Greek Cypriots said no. Prime Minister Erdogan keeps on referring to this to explain that this was unjust, because the reason he calls it unjust is because the peace talks on Cyprus were coordinated with Cyprus's desire as an island, albeit divided, to enter the EU, and coordinated also with Turkey's desire to gain accession talks with the EU. Ultimately, it failed. What happened was that the EU went ahead and took the island of Cyprus, which is represented in the EU only by the Greek Cypriots who have international recognition. The Turkish Cypriots were left out. They continued to stay in isolation. And then it became a problem between Turkey and the EU, because the EU is now insisting on Turkey opening its ports and airports to the Greek Cypriot ships and aircraft in accordance with the Customs Union Agreement that it has signed with the EU. I heard Mr. Erdogan say that he will not move on this issue unless gestures are made towards the Turkish Cypriots. And when I get on to the subject of the Turkish-EU relationship, this seems to be the one issue that will allow countries which are opposed to Turkish entry for other reasons to hide behind, to effectively block Turkey's entry into the EU. Now, so if you look at the map, the one country, the one area that Turkey has not settled its problems or moved towards settling its problems, notwithstanding the talks that are still underway in Cyprus, is Cyprus. Now, further afield, Turkey began to engage in a wider diplomatic effort directed at Africa, Latin America, countries that Turkey had not been interested in before. And sure enough, it paid dividends, because Turkey got elected for the first time in 5 decades to the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member at the beginning of this year. So this was a tangible success for the changing foreign policy outlook of Turkey. This had not happened for 5 decades, so this government certainly deserves the credit for this. Now, it has also put itself forward, and this is very much part of the Turkish approach to foreign policy, as a mediator. It's put itself forward as a mediator, of course, between Syria and Israel. That continued for some time, albeit unsuccessfully. continued right up to the moment when the Israelis actually attacked Gaza at the end of last year, and Prime Minister Erdogan was very much annoyed that Mr. Olmert came to Ankara. He tried to encourage him to move forward with the Syrians, and Mr. Olmert did not say anything about the war that he was about to launch into Gaza. And some people explain Prime Minister Erdogan's anger on the Gaza issue and tie it to the fact that he was misled by Mr. Olmert on this issue. Turkey has also put itself forward more recently as a mediator between Syria and Iraq, also between Iran and Pakistan. They've recently had a dispute after the explosions in Balochistan. Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, Turkey's tried to mediate between the two sides. Hamas and Fatah, the two Palestinian factions. Hezbollah and the other factions in Lebanon. Bosnia and Serbia, believe it or not. Serbia and Kosovo. The Turkish president finally visited Serbia, which is a significant move. I wonder how that was perceived by those who are not too happy with Serb actions in the past. But anyway, Turkey's put itself forward as a country that wants stability and peace beyond its borders. The Caucasus Stability Pact, of course, was very much part of this approach. Now, parallel to all of this, of course, Turkey has maintained its relationship with the U.S. And, as I said at the outset, it has also gained accession. It has begun accession negotiations with the EU, and therefore has maintained its commitment to the Western community of nations. Now, the difference is between earlier periods when Turkey showed interest beyond its borders, most notably in the 1950s, is that Turks are not doing this on behalf of its allies, not at the behest of its allies, but Turkey is now trying to come up with a new rationale for its foreign policy. Prime Minister Erdogan and Foreign Minister Davutoğlu has said that previously others determined our agenda. From now on, we wish to determine our agenda. And one could argue that even the United States does not completely and totally and absolutely determine its own agenda, even though it's a superpower. The extent to which Turkey is able to do it comes into question. But nonetheless, that is the intention. And they are making this approach not on behalf of the West, but on behalf of themselves. Although, as I will get into, as explain in a couple of minutes, they very much want this to dovetail with a new relationship that they want to establish with the West, to which they still remain committed to. Now, let's quickly look back at Turkish foreign policy and what are we talking about? Maybe I should have done this at the outset. Frankly, from 1923 until the beginning of the Second World War, or the end of the Second World War, we're not really focusing on Turkish foreign policy when we look at Turkey. We're talking about Turkish domestic politics. The massive reforms that we don't have time to get into, that Kemal Atatürk initiated and implemented in order to make Turkey part of the Western community of nations. Okay? Now, then, after the Second World War, as I mentioned, there was the Russian-Soviet threat to Turkey, which forced Turkey to look to the United States. With the Truman Doctrine, Turkey, the U.S. took over from Britain the role of supporting Turkey, along with Greece. Then it applied to join NATO, which was created in 1949, and it was rebuffed not once, but twice, and was not admitted until February 1952. And the reason it was rebuffed was, as it was explained at the time, that there are eerie similarities to the kind of arguments that are being used today on Turkey's EU application, which is that it's not really part of the Judeo-Western civilization. The Transatlantic Alliance is not just a collective defense organization, it is more than that. And the British in particular argued that Turkey should be part of, not of NATO, but of a separate Middle East defense organization, because that would help them buttress the post-Second World War role in the Middle East, most notably in Egypt, where the British had a major base in Port Said. Anyway, a deal was struck because the U.S. pressured the British, and Turkey was admitted into NATO in February 1952. But then, Turkey also pushed ahead with the British and the French in trying to set up a separate Middle East defense organization. Initially, in October 1951, it was called MEDO, Middle East Defense Organization. Then the Middle East Command in August 52 didn't work because, frankly, the Arab countries were not too interested in following Turkey's lead. In essence, what happened was that in order to confirm that it was part of the Western community of nations, Turkey wanted to join NATO, but the price of its entry was for it to turn towards the Arab world, which it had shunned in order to join the Western world. Now, it didn't work because all the countries in the Arab world, with the exception of Iraq between 1955 and 58, said no to the Turks. And the Baghdad Pact that was established in 1955 lasted as the Baghdad Pact until the Iraqi Revolution of 1958, and then it collapsed. Now, the reason I focus on this is because this was the last major opening to the Arab world, to the Islamic world, that Turkey engaged in, and it was done as part of its relationship with the West. In other words, it was a function of that relationship with the West. And the contrast I wish to draw is between that and what is being done now, because it's not being done at the behest of the West. Now, what we're really talking about is something that's possible only in the change conditions of the post-Cold War world. Because throughout the rest of the Cold War period, essentially everything was frozen. You couldn't have an opening to Bulgaria because it was part of the Warsaw Pact. You couldn't have an opening in the Caucasus because they were all part of the Soviet Union. And frankly, everything was stuck. And of course, with Greece, you have the Cyprus problem throughout that period. Throughout this period, Turkey was a loyal and often neglected ally of the West in the very southeast corner of Europe. And it didn't really have an independent foreign policy separate from those of its Western allies. With the changing situation in post-Cold War era, we've got a different system. And what we have is a different relationship between Turkey and its main ally, the United States. What we have is the removal of the central plank of that relationship, which is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the common enemy that bound Turkey and the United States together. Turkey and the United States don't have geographic, commercial, cultural, religious, ethnic links. This was a relationship that was born of mutual need during the Cold War. Once the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union disappeared, the two sides agreed to maintain the relationship, but without redefining it in any way. So what you had was ad hoc cooperation, BTC, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, for example, but they did not redefine it in any way that significantly altered the relationship or defined it. So what we have is an ad hoc arrangement, as I said. Now, of course, what happened was previously unthinkable disagreements began to occur between Turkey and the United States. March 2003. Simply would not have happened in the Cold War period. One ally wanted to attack Iraq, the United States in this case, Iraq, and another ally said, no, thank you, I'm not going to let you go through my territory. And that would not have happened in the Cold War. And that's precisely the environment in which Turkey can make the kind of openings it is making to those countries on its borders and beyond, which it would not have been able to do during the Cold War. Now, of course, with the end of the Cold War, Turkey also accelerated. Let's look at the other aspect of Turkey's alignment with the West, to join the European Union. It was in the 1980s that the late Prime Minister, then President Özal, I think it was 87, applied or renewed the application to the European Union. And when this government came in 2002, it pushed ahead with that effort, and ultimately it began negotiations. But they're not going far and they're not going fast. And in fact, we could say that they're now stalled. The two continental dynamos of the EU, Germany and France, are opposed for similar reasons and with similar justifications to Turkey's accession. They're talking about a privileged partnership, both Chancellor Merkel and President Sarkozy. The British are less vocal in their support for Turkey than before, and there isn't support on the part of the European public in any of the European countries. So this may be the case that for the first time a country will have started accession negotiations and not actually become part of the European Union. So, the U.S. relationship is changed nonetheless, it's important, as President Obama's visit in April confirms. The European Union will always be Turkey's major trading partner for all sorts of reasons. Germany, of course, at the head of it. But it may be that Turkey will not join the European Union. And at that time, to go back to where I started, Turkey is beginning to open up to the outside world. And that's the question that we need to ask. Can Turkey use its relationships with these countries for the benefit of its Western allies? Perhaps to help persuade the Europeans in particular that it needs to be included. Turkish leaders have often argued that Turkey, the European Union, only becomes a global power if it lets Turkey in. Good point. But then the Europeans might say that, do we really want to border with Syria, Iraq, Iran, and the troubled Caucasus? Would it not be better to have Turkey as a buffer between us and these troubled areas? Maybe Europe's border should not end on the Bosphorus, but where Bulgaria and Greece meet Turkey. And the strategic arguments may not actually work with the Europeans. We will see. Now, the trouble with being the bridge that the Turks have talked about between the Western world that they're linked to, through NATO, through the EU accession process, and of course the special relationship with the US, and the Islamic world and beyond that they're linked to in all sorts of religious and cultural ways, is that it works when the two sides are on good terms with each other. And that's not always the case. Now, Turkey, Prime Minister Erdogan was asked specifically when he was in Iran whether Turkey wanted to be a mediator between Iran and the US. Logic dictates that he does, but he said only if both sides invite us, because I think he understands the risks of him trying to explain the American case in Iran, and when he comes to Washington, to explain the Iranian case to the US. Being a bridge is okay when the two on either side of the bridge are on good terms. When they're not, you may end up pleasing nobody, and that's very much a danger in Turkish foreign policy. Now, how does energy fit into the picture? Well, very significantly. I mean, clearly with the Russians, we're talking about to a great extent. With the Iranians, less so, but still to a great extent. Now, let's go back a little bit. Until the 1980s, energy was not even a factor in Turkish foreign policy. Two pipelines were built, actually three. Two sets of pipelines were built. The Turkish-Iraqi pipeline was built, bringing Iraqi oil close to Adana, the place called Yumurtalık, to markets through the Mediterranean. Turkey cut that in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And then two pipelines came through Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria to Turkey, bringing gas to Turkey, beginning the process by which Turkey became quite dependent on Russian gas, to the point that now it's 2/3 dependent on Russian gas. Iranian gas also matters. For those who are taking figures, the amount of gas that comes from Russia via the land routes is 14 billion cubic meters. There's another pipeline that was built from Russia to Turkey called Blue Stream underneath the Black Sea. It's 16 billion cubic meters, 30 altogether. And with Iran, as of now, it's 10 billion cubic meters, and it could go higher. So these are significant relationships. Where Turkey's energy policies really came to the fore was after the Cold War ended. Caspian Sea energy resources became available for research and development, and bringing those to market was a question, and Turkey cooperated with the United States in the development of the East-West energy corridor, which would bring oil initially, although gas was also talked about right from the very beginning, to world markets through Turkey. That eventually became the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, and a gas pipeline was ultimately built to bring gas from Azerbaijan as far as Erzurum, which you can see on the map, with talk of developing the East-West pipeline, gas pipeline, out to go to Europe, ultimately to European markets, and that was going to be, that's the Nabucco project that people have talked about. Now, many American officials assumed during this period, with the success of the BTC, that Turkey would be interested in the transportation of hydrocarbons from east to west as it developed itself as an energy hub. Not true. Soon after the BTC was concluded, Turkey signed the Blue Stream agreements for a gas pipeline coming from Russia to Turkey, that's to say from north to south. So from the Turkish point of view, it became clear that they were interested in transporting gas not only from east to west, but also from north to south. And if you actually look at the amount of gas, hydrocarbons that are being transported from east to west and north to south, more is transported from north to south than from east to west. The Turks are actually talking about with the Samsun Ceyhan pipeline that I talked about to bring oil across Turkey to world markets through the Mediterranean port of Ceyhan, which is also where the Baku-Tbilisi line ends. They're also talking about extending this energy corridor down to Israel and maybe further afield. So the north-south corridor is also becoming significant. Equally significantly, the Turks, even just after concluding the Nabucco intergovernmental agreement, which, as I said, is designed to bring gas from the Caspian region, perhaps Turkmenistan down the road, certainly Azerbaijan, to Europe, as an alternative to Russian gas, because frankly that was the raison d'etre of the Nabucco project, have talked about putting Russian gas into this. Now, one can understand the logic from the Russian point of view. You can't see Ukraine on the map, but most Russian gas that goes to most of the Russian gas that goes to Europe goes across Ukraine. Ever since the Orange Revolution and with Mr. Yushchenko having become president of Ukraine, there's been a very, very difficult relationship, to say the least, between Russia and Ukraine. And there have been times when that pipeline was cut. The European consumers were unhappy, the Russian producers were unhappy, and the Ukrainians, of course, were in the middle. The idea of sending gas south, either through South Stream, which is supposed to go to Bulgaria, but part of the line might go through the Turkish Economic Zone, or into the Nabucco pipeline, which might go through Turkey on its way to Europe, is certainly attractive from the Russian point of view as a way of squeezing the Ukrainians. But it does defeat the object of the exercise, initial object of the exercise, which was to develop an alternative line. Because the essence of the BTC line was that it would end the Russian monopoly on the transportation and obviate the need to use Iran, which is extremely attractive because of its proximity and because of the possibility of swaps. Now, the idea was that you would again, provide an alternative to Russia. The Turks are suggesting otherwise. More recently, the Turks have suggested that Nabucco could be filled with Iranian gas. Because Turkmen gas seems to be committed for the foreseeable future, either to Russia or China. There's no agreement among the 5 states that now border the Caspian, as opposed to the 2 that previously bordered it, which is the Soviet Union and Iran, on a pipeline that could go across the Caspian. With all the difficulties in the Caucasus, people may not be interested in additional investments in pipelines in the Caucasus. So Turks are suggesting, well, we may have a shortage of gas to fill this pipeline. Why don't we put Iranian gas? Well, the U.S. is resolutely opposed to this. It's not too happy about Russian gas getting into the Nabucco pipeline, but it's resolutely opposed to the Iranian gas. In fact, there is a law, what used to be called ILSA, the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which has now become the Iran Sanctions Act, ever since Libya was let out of the leper colony, as it were, that imposes secondary sanctions on organizations, governmental or otherwise, that invest or get engaged in the Iranian energy market beyond, I think it was $20 or $25 million, if I'm not mistaken. So this is one issue where Turkey is not on the same wavelength as with the United States. Now, I talked a little bit more than I thought I would, but forgive me. I think we go until 5:30, right? We started 4?
We started at
4, okay. Now, the Turkey and with this I'll wrap up, and I'll just talk about 3 different scenarios. But before then, I really want to impress on you that the country we're talking about, whose foreign policy and energy policy we're talking about, is very different from the one that was established by Kemal Atatürk 86 years ago, and even one that was there, let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago. To begin with, the country's opened up itself to the global economy. And that was done not by this government, although certainly this government has continued it, but Prime Minister Özal after 1980, especially after 1983 when he won the elections. Turkey is a country which is the biggest economy in the Middle East. I think it's the 7th biggest economy in Europe, and it may be either the 17th or the 18th in the world. There are lots and lots of problems with the Turkish economy, of course, but this is a country which is now engaging with the rest of the world in trade in a way that it wasn't. So this is a fact that I think ought not to be missed as we look at foreign and energy policies. Secondly, the domestic situation in Turkey is very different. We've had coalition governments for a considerable period before this particular party won power in 2002. It's brought stability, but at the same time, it has brought tensions because it has roots in the Islamist movement, and yet it has to operate in a strict secular framework. And those tensions came to the fore with the Constitutional Court case. Now, clearly, this is the most popular party in Turkey. It's likely to win the next elections, whether they're held in 2010 or 2011, which is the latest that they have to be held by. Turkey's changed because domestically, because what you've seen is an accommodation, a very difficult compromise, shall we say, with the strict secular framework and the growing religiosity of the people within it. Nonetheless, it still remains a secular state, although those tensions within it, I think, will be a factor in determining Turkish foreign policy to some extent or others, because ultimately foreign policy is a product of domestic politics. Let me finish with the 3 scenarios that I foresee for Turkish foreign policy. Turkey moves to EU membership, maintains a special relationship with the United States, and brings its enhanced prestige and weight in the rest of the world, in its immediate environment and beyond, for the benefit of the Western community that it will now be a part of, not just as an ally in NATO, but also as an EU member. Turkey is not admitted into the EU, is the second scenario. But nonetheless, it does maintain a special relationship with the United States and brings to bear that special relationship, brings the relationship, the value of those relationships into the alliance with the United States, and the U.S. goes for an enhanced relationship with Turkey. The third, and that's the one that some Cassandras are worried about, Turkey is not admitted into the EU. Then there is a crisis with the U.S. Let's say if the resolution on an Armenian genocide is accepted by the Congress, then there is a break. Then Turkey will look for another world, another set of relationships, and those will undoubtedly include Russia and the immediate neighbors in the Middle East, as well as beyond. We will see. I don't think that Turkey wants to cut itself from the West. Certainly it sees advantages in looking both ways, as Prime Minister Erdogan said in Tehran. But so those 3 scenarios, I think, are the ones that we'll be looking at. Sorry I talked longer than I thought I would, but then I'll stop.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. Tyler?
Okay, so I think the most interesting thing to me that comes out of what you're saying here is that this kind of set of scenarios works as long as there are no true dangers in the world. So insofar as during the Cold War things worked differently, that was because, at least perceptually, there was an actual danger that had to be dealt with the Turks. So you can, in the modern world, essentially say to the United States, well, yes, we'll still deal with you and we like you and you're fine, but we won't go along with most of the things that you think are important, because really, in the end, there's no obvious danger. Now, that works as long as, so it only works as long as the United States remains powerful enough to prevent real dangers from arising. But should the United States stop being powerful enough, then Turkey has to go back to the United States, right? I mean, if you see what I mean. So as long as, let's say, the Russians are not dangerous,
Right.
then you can tell the United States, well, we're going to have a nice relationship with the Russians and we're going to downplay our relationship with you. As long as the Iranians don't have a nuclear weapon that you somehow think suddenly threatens you, you can say, well, we'll be this bridge and we'll be nice to the Iranians and we'll be nice to you. But these are not stable this is not a stable situation. So something is going to happen to destabilize that situation. Some actual enemy or perceived enemy will appear, and then you won't be able to play that role of being nice to everybody.
Well, look, the math doesn't hold up. You can't have zero problems with all these neighbors. It's impossible.
Correct.
Okay? And as you get close to one, you will then get embroiled in that neighbor's problems with another neighbor, as we saw with the Armenian Azeri case.
You can do that as long as there's no big problem on the horizon.
Right. Now, the Turks don't regard Russia. If you look at the opinion polls, if you ask them, which is a bigger threat to world peace, the U.S. or Russia, they say the U.S. by
Yes.
far.
Yes.
They don't perceive Russia as a threat.
But they're wrong. I mean, Russia is a threat. Russia will be a threat.
That's not the perception in Turkey.
I understand that, but something again. I don't think this is what I'm saying is I don't think this scenario can last for very long for Turkey because something will come along to destabilize it. Most likely, the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon. I mean, that's the single most likely scenario to cause. So what happens then?
Good question. Look, let me refer to Prime Minister Erdogan being in Iran. There he was. He was meeting the Iranian leaders. No doubt this was the main item in their discussion. And yet Prime Minister Erdogan came out and said that, the countries that were pushing Iran on this issue were being unfair. So obviously at this moment there isn't a threat perception on the part of the Turks.
That's correct. But when the Iranians announce we have built a nuclear weapon, I think that will change.
And also there's a practical problem for the Turks. The issue is going to come up to the Security Council at some stage, and the Turks are going to have to say yes or no or abstain.
Yeah, but they can hide behind the Chinese and the Russians in the Security Council.
Assuming the Russians and the Chinese, don't back the embargo. But again, look, the scenarios are that there is a deal with the Iranians, which is great if that works out. There is no deal, in which case the U.S. goes to hard air embargo at the Security Council, which is a problem for the Turks. A, in the voting, and B, in the implementation, because Turkey has a close relationship with Iran. And the third alternative, which is the one that nobody really wants, which is that the U.S. moves ahead, or Israel moves ahead and takes out the nuclear potential of Iran, or
the fourth one, that the Iranians actually announced they had made a nuclear weapon.
in which case, then, as some people in Washington are talking about, you go to containment. And I'm not a specialist on whether it would work with Iran as it did with the Soviet Union, but it's not. Look, Turkey didn't choose this neighborhood. It didn't want to be a neighbor to a country which may be developing nuclear weapons. But actually, Prime Minister Erdogan is taking this head on. Not only has he not condemned the Iranian nuclear program, but he's also said, how about countries that have nuclear weapons? And referred to Israel, for example, to much to the annoyance of Israel and its friends. So, what I was trying to say is that the perception on the part of the Turks is not that kind of problem is imminent. And that discussion is not taking place along the lines of what you suggest. Now, it may come to pass, but that's not the case now.
The interesting thing is it's not taking place anywhere. The extent to which everyone thinks that no real serious enemies will arise for anyone is quite impressive in the world. And since it's never been true in the world, in the history of the world, it's kind of surprising to me that it's the same debate that doesn't happen about China, where no one actually says, well, what happens if the Chinese actually don't turn out to be nice guys?
Oh, there are people who are saying that in Washington, and I can name them.
There are people who do, but very, very few of them, and the overall perception is, well, that's not going to happen. So, I find it quite shocking that, given the fact that every time there's been a situation where something can arise, it does, eventually something arises, that no one says, oh, well,
Well, to turn to Russia for a second, the idea of Russia being a threat to Turkey is almost inconceivable now. Because when the Russians went into Georgia, the Turkish reaction was, it's okay, we can talk to the Russians. And Prime Minister Erdogan went to Moscow. They were reassured to the extent that they pushed ahead with the Stability Pact. Now, I don't know, I can't imagine a scenario in which Russia would threaten Turkish interests directly because they seem to see advantages in weaning Turkey away from its previous line on the energy policies, for example, or using the Turkish alternative to squeeze the Ukrainians, again, for example.
But again, do you want to put yourself in a position where you're so dependent on Russian gas that if the Russians decide to squeeze you, you're squeezed?
2/3 of your gas comes from there, and there's no way you can reverse it now.
Well, so therefore, it's not a question of being perceived. They are in a position where they're massively threatened by Russia. They just don't think the Russians are going to use.
Well, you know what? It is mutually beneficial for the moment for both sides. I would argue, for the moment. Well, you know, in the long run, we're all dead, as Keynes said. And, you know, I can see advantages for both Russia and Turkey in maintaining this relationship. And frankly, I think the U.S. has got to come to terms with that. This is now an unchanging, permanent part of the equation.
Can I jump in on this one? Because I want to think about it. Same ones. Just briefly on Russia, and then I want to go to Iran. You know, this standard economic theory tells us the holder of the fixed assets is at a disadvantage in this case, right? So the person who puts in the pipelines is dependent on whoever's going to deliver the gas, which was why for a long time the West didn't want the Germans to have pipelines to get Russian gas, because once you've got the pipelines in place, the delivery of gas is in the bargaining seat, and we want to change the terms of the bargain. You've made that investment, and the person who's actually delivering these goods has you over a barrel. Right? This is why Oliver Williamson got his Nobel Prize, right? Fixed assets, actually, transaction-specific assets, put you in a poor position to renegotiate. The other person's actually in a stronger position because you already made your investment. So even aside from whatever the security threat is coming from Russia, just the very fact that they're economically dependent now on Russian gas would seem to be that at some point Russia is going to put Turkey in a poorer bargaining position, the same way that it's done with Ukraine or other East European states. So it seems to me that there is some reason to worry about Russian.
I'll add something else to your worry. Now, a lot of the gas that the Russians are selling to the Turks are gas that the Russians are buying cheaper elsewhere and selling more expensively to the Turks, specifically Turkmen gas, Uzbek gas. You know, particularly the Turkmen gas might have come to Turkey if the Trans-Caspian pipeline had been built. And in fact, the Turkmen president, Niyazov, complained about Blue Stream, saying that if you had not built Blue Stream, then maybe you could have focused on Turkmen gas. Now, but that debate is now behind, has been left behind by the Turks. When Putin came, the extent to which the Turkey moved ahead with these suggests that they're not as worried as perhaps those outside are about the dependence.
Where I actually wanted to go was a little bit more along the lines of, it might not be possible to be friends with everyone.
Sure.
And beyond the Iranian nuclear issue, it seems to me that there's already considerable concern in the Arab states with Iran as sort of the winner of this whole Iraqi fiasco, right? So they're expanding their influence there. There's a nuclear program. They've got some more influence in Afghanistan, with Afghanistan becoming problematic. And it is the Arab states who are particularly concerned about Iranians' influence and deliberate strategies by the Saudis, among others, to sort of keep the lid on Iranian expansion. Trying to control the price of oil in a certain sense that would hurt the Iranians, and they have sort of a target price for that. So it seems to me that even beyond the Iranian nuclear threat, there is you can't have it both ways. You can't be friends with all the Arab states and the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and with the Iranians. And at some point you're going to have to pick and choose because your friends, or the states you'd like to be friends with, are not friends with each other. So, you know, at some point the old friends of my friends and etc. But so at some point Turkey is going to have to pick and choose, and that's why I never quite understood this move towards rapprochement with Iran. Because that seems like the costlier strategy, not only vis-a-vis the United States, but also with other Arab countries.
So far it's worked because I think, you know, from the point of view of, let's say, leave aside Syria and Iraq, but let's say Riyadh or Amman, and to a lesser extent with Cairo, which has always been a traditional rival of Istanbul and now Ankara for influence, you want to maintain your relationship with Turkey for your own reasons. And at some stage, like you say, if the tensions build up, or as you say, you know, you have a crisis, then it's impossible for you to be friends with everybody. But at this moment, it seems to be working because Turkey has a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Egypt less so. Like I said, it's a rival, and we saw that when Egypt and Turkey were not on the same wavelength after Gaza as they were trying to persuade Hamas to go for the ceasefire, and as they've been trying to persuade Hamas to go into a deal with Fatah. But again, the Iran-Turkish relationship is somewhat improbable because, like I said, one is the center of Shiism, the other is mostly Sunni Hanafi. It was a seat of the Caliphate, the Sunni Caliphate, until the beginning of last century, until the second decade of the last century. Now, and yet, and even more, Iran is the antithesis. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the antithesis of the secular Turkish Republic. So it doesn't make sense. And yet both sides seem to have advantages. Now, when the crisis comes, be it a tougher embargo or armed action or a nuclear Iran, then I think it will be very difficult to make everybody happy. But as of now, it seems to be working, or at least certainly the Turkish government believes so.
I just want to comment on your question about Turkish-Iranian relations. I mean, I think that the main reason is because Turkey and Iran shares a common enemy, and specifically Kurdish nationalism. And I mean, my understanding is that especially after 2003 invasion, all these four countries, Syria, the Arabs in Iraq, Turkey and Iran, basically become irritated with the rise of Kurdish nationalism. So the question is that they can have kind of a zero problem approach, mainly because they share a common enemy, which is the Kurdish
Well, we could go back further. Yep. The coordination between Damascus, Tehran, and Ankara actually goes back to the first Gulf War, because they established a trilateral
autonomy of the Kurdish
coordination, and because each is unhappy with the possibility that northern Iraq might become a Kurdish state. The Iranians have their own problems. Turkey has its own problems. Each has a problem. Again, Kurdish problem within their borders, and it is a factor.
So I have a kind of question.
Yes.
I mean, how do you evaluate the role of domestic politics in shaping Turkish foreign policy? And let me just try to be more specific.
Yes.
I mean, recently, as you say, we see some kind of a cold relationship between Turkey and Israel, mainly because of the Turkish reaction to what is going on in Gaza. But I mean, the same things basically happened in 2006 when the Israel attacked Lebanon, and then they basically destroyed all Lebanese infrastructure in retaliation to Hezbollah actions. But then, I mean, the Turkish reaction was kind of more measured by that time. But I mean, the scale of violence was not less even by then. So my question is that, is it because of the change in Turkish strategic interests that we are seeing the Turkish government becoming less friendly with Israel, or mainly because of the ideas through which the Turkish government perceived Israel that we are seeing a cold relationship? So in the sense that, is it because the Turkish government has more nationalist Islamic sensibilities, or mainly because, especially after the 2003 invasion, Turkey no longer needs Israel as much as Israel needs Turkey?
You know, I was in Turkey for 4 days recently, just last week. And the argument that was being constantly made was that Israel needs Turkey more than Turkey needs Israel. That wasn't the case before, because the relationship stretches back to the 1950s. There was a military cooperation, there was intelligence sharing. Israel was a factor in counting efforts to get the recognition for the genocide claim. Exactly. Now that's changed. Now, we will see. Are they going to make up again, as they did after earlier tensions, or is this now permanent feature or seemingly permanent feature of Turkish foreign policy? Now, clearly, the tough line that Mr. Erdogan has taken from Davos on, in particular, has made him very popular with the Arab world. Now, one could say that the more popular he becomes with the Arab street, the less popular he will be with the Arab governments, because they worry about somebody going above their heads to their people. So it may be impossible for Turkey to sustain a close relationship with the governments while the Turkish leaders are becoming more popular with the Arab street. Now, in the long run, what's Turkey going to do with Israel? Turkey's not going to fight Israel. It's not going to fight the Palestinians' war. It's not going to sell soldiers to Gaza to fight Israel. There seems to be mileage in the tough line that is taking on Israel with the Islamic world and the Arab world. I don't know how far that will go, and whether that becomes a factor, a negative factor in Turkey's relationship with the West, particularly with the United States.
Certainly won't make a negative factor with Europe.
Well, now Europe is not the mood has changed in Europe quite a bit. I mean, Iran, after the most recent events, they're tougher on Ahmadinejad than they used to be. Yeah, they're tough on Israel, but if the Turkish-Israeli relationship deteriorates, To a certain point, certainly, for example, with Sarkozy, I can see a kickback. I'm not sure whether you would say that reaction from Sarkozy. But anyway, we'll see whether it actually causes strains with.
And will you also say that Turkish military is not really opposing the changes in Turkish foreign policy led by the government?
I didn't get into that. I mean, I wasn't focusing on the formation of foreign policy, but rather on the priorities. It's security policies that matter to the military rather than a foreign policy, the details of foreign policy. Clearly, they're a major factor in relations with Iraq, and particularly with northern Iraq. And the fact that Turkey has not moved ahead with closer relations with the KRG is very much in the interest of the Turkish military that does not believe that you should buttress the KRG. You had a question?
I have two questions. One is, who are the important friends for Turkey? If something happens in terms of economic issues, in terms of trade and security issues, if things happen, who are the essential partners that Turkey really must maintain? And then my second question is...
In economic terms or otherwise? You didn't specify.
Economic, trade, and maybe
Yeah.
security. And my second question is there any effort in Turkey to diversify the sources of its energy, either by trying to find alternate sources of gas and oil, or by trying to develop alternative sources like hydraulic or nuclear or any kind of alternative energy source?
Let's start with the second. Yeah, there is discussion of nuclear power. In fact, a Russian company with a Turkish partner won the tender, but that tender does not seem to be going very far. It seems to be stalled. As for looking alternatives, look, the people are beginning to talk about Blue Stream 2 to bring additional Russian gas to Turkey, either to go into the Turkish market or to be put into Nabucco or to be sent on to Israel. You got Russia, Iran accounting for most of the gas that you get. Now, people have talked, you get 6.8 billion cubic meters you're going to get from Azeri gas if the dispute with Azerbaijan does not make that impossible down the road. There's talk of getting some from Iraq, from northern Iraq, although the relationship with the KRG and the failure to get an energy agreement on energy issues between the Kurds and the central government in Iraq is a problem. And you also get LNG from Nigeria and Algeria to the point to about 5 billion cubic meters. There's some oil. There is some oil in Turkey, not much. Gas is almost negligible, as far as I know. And you're stuck where you're stuck. I mean, these are you play the cards as you find them. Now, Özal had moved ahead with the deal with the Russians back in the 80s, and then in the 90s you added Blue Stream to it, and you now have this relationship with Russia, and you're now fitting Russia into even the East-West Corridor project that you're cooperating with. So you seem to be riding both horses, and we'll see how far that goes. In terms of important friends, who could Turkey rely on? Well, in the old days, they always used to say Pakistan is the closest ally. I mean, Pakistan is a long way away, and it's got its own problems. Maybe Tayyip Erdogan, rather than looking for an AK, instead of looking for one particular friend, getting a lot of friends. But we'll see. When you need to call on them, how much are they going to support you? Now, when you were up as a candidate for the Security Council, they came through. But when the question is, will they come up with more if you're in a bigger crisis? When you need them more in a crisis.
So how about in economic terms?
Outside the energy sector, you mean? Well, look, the majority of Turkey's trade is still with Western Europe. Again, I mean, I didn't get a chance to get into it because it's really beyond the scope of the presentation. But the whole Turkish process of Westernization ought not to be ignored as we discuss where Turkey is going. The Turks went into Europe as conquerors, met the Europeans on the battlefield, not in good circumstances. They were defeated, and then as they were defeated, they said, we need to learn the ways of the ones who defeated us, and that led to the desire to modernize, which became synonymous with Westernization, which became synonymous with a relationship with the Europeans. So, in spite of all the problems that Turkey has with its EU accession process, nonetheless, when people talk about the West, they think of Europe. When they think of the outside world, they still think of Europe. Now, most people don't still think of going down to Damascus or Riyadh or Baghdad when they want to leave Turkey. They still want to go to Europe. 3 million Turks living in Germany, many more in large numbers in Holland, France, and elsewhere. The people-to-people contact, difficult though it is, adapting to Western societies, has led Turks to go and live in Western societies. That's contributed to something. And what I'm trying to say in a circuitous way is that Europe still matters a great deal. Western Europe still matters a great deal to the Turks. Please.
Do you think there will be a solution in the near future in Cyprus? I mean, the Greek side doesn't look like it has any incentive to make any...
You know what, I not only was I born in Cyprus, but I actually worked on the Cyprus problem for some time, both at the UN and in Washington. And one of the reasons, I moved from academia in Oxford into this field, I mean, it was because I thought that there was going to be a deal in the mid-1980s. January 1985 was where the summit was. I'd love to believe that it's going to work, but I don't think so.
I mean, there is no, it doesn't look there's any incentive in the Greek side, or even at the Turkish side. I mean, Turkey itself is kind of losing money, but there is no apparent incentive there right now.
No, and then we have to think of what happens if this continues. And if this continues, it becomes an effective block to Turkey's EU entry. So when I was talking about these different scenarios, the most plausible scenario for the end of Turkey's efforts to join the EU is for the Cyprus issue to be put to the fore. You did not open your ports, therefore, many chapters are frozen, as you know, and it effectively comes to an end. Now, I listened to Mr. Erdogan say that he will not open those ports and airports, not once but twice in meetings. So it's quite clear that he's not going to do it. So the Europeans have let this deadline go at the end of this year. But the question is, how long will this continue? And how long can Mr. Talat and Mr. Christofias keep on talking, with no apparent success? Look, in natural sciences, there's always a solution. In social sciences and diplomatic relations, sometimes there are insoluble problems. Maybe this is one of them. Maybe Karabakh is also one of them. Maybe the Arab-Israeli issue.
Is even more insoluble.
I don't know. How can you compare insoluble problems to each other? I was going to refer to the Arab-Israeli issue, or the Israeli-Palestinian to be more accurate. Yeah. So there may be some issues which are beyond it. And then what you do is you go around them. So the Turks will have to work around it. The Europeans will have to work around a failure to solve this problem. 2004 was a great opportunity. It could have happened. Didn't happen. Can we take a couple more? Sure. If there is anybody else. Unless everybody's... I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Very enjoyable. Thank you for inviting me in.